The kingdom of heaven is like a faithful slave and a wicked slave who are waiting for their master to return at an unknown hour. The kingdom of heaven is like 10 bridesmaids waiting with their lamps for a bridegroom who has been delayed. And the kingdom of heaven is like a wealthy man who goes on a journey, and before leaving, he entrusts large sums of money to 3 of his slaves, 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent, respectively. Today's gospel reading from Matthew is the third in a series of parables that are a part of a larger eschatological discourse. It's a big word that means the end, right? The final things. Jesus is talking about the end. He's talking about the end because he's going away soon. He and his disciples are in Jerusalem for Passover. He's only days away from his death. And he's talking about the end because he wants to prepare them for how to live as they wait for his return. So we have these series of these 3 parables. They have different characters and different settings, but similar themes. People waiting for the arrival of someone important. Slaves waiting for their master, and bridesmaids waiting for a bridegroom. As Amy Jill Levine observes, the gospel writers, in their wisdom, left most of the parables as open narratives in order to invite us into engagement with them. So parables don't function as a simple morality tale that has a singular, obvious meaning, if only. They are meant to be open-ended, interpreted in different ways by different people in different contexts. Parables are there to surprise us and to challenge our assumptions. As we take a closer look at the parable of the talents this morning, I'd like to consider together the ways that this parable surprises us and challenges us. The parable starts with a man going on a journey, and we know that he is a rich man because of the amount of money that he entrusts to his slaves or servants. A talent would have been a unit of measurement that was used to weigh precious metals, and it was equal to roughly 6,000 denarii. A denarius was a daily wage for common laborers, so it was the average amount that a day laborer could make in 1 day's worth of work. So 1 talent would be roughly equivalent to 20 years' wages for the average worker. And 5 talents would have been worth 100 years of labor. That's a lot of money. And here we have our first surprising detail of the parable. The master is entrusting his slaves with enormous amounts of money. Jesus' original audience may not have been so surprised by this scenario because in the ancient world, slaves often served as managers of the estates of their wealthy landowner masters. And slaves could even earn money and buy property. Some common means of investing money would have been to lend money to money changers who would use that money to turn a profit and then split the profit with their investors. Or someone could lend money at interest directly. While this scenario of a master relying on trained accountants to multiply his capital would have been a familiar one for Jesus' disciples, I suspect that they also would have been taken aback by the sheer amount of money that is given here in the story. It is a gift of abundance. It's a detail that's meant to catch our attention. The first 2 slaves do exactly what they are supposed to do. They double their investments. When the master finally returns from his trip, his words of affirmation and blessing are identical for both. Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. These words, enter into the joy of your master, they hint at feasting. The master will celebrate this good news, his expanding wealth, and they are invited to celebrate or to feast with him. But where the parable takes a turn for the unexpected is with the actions of the third servant. Does he take his talent and invest it? Does he turn a profit for his master? He does not. He takes it and he buries it in the ground. Now, to our modern ears, this probably sounds a little comical, kind of like someone takes a bunch of cash and stuffs it under a mattress. But in the ancient world, burying money in the ground was a known practice. It was a way to keep valuables safe. The third servant is being cautious. When he is called to his master to settle his accounts, he says, 'Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.'" Now, what follows is maybe the most surprising and unsettling part of the story. The master's response is one of anger. He calls the slave wicked and lazy and worthless. He doesn't acknowledge the accusation of being a harsh master, but he does tell the slave that if he knew that he reaped where he didn't sow and gathered where he didn't scatter, he should have at least placed his money in the bank, where it would have earned some interest. He takes the slave's talent, he gives it to the one who has 10 talents, and he orders for him to be thrown out into the outer darkness. And this is where the complexity of the parable truly reveals itself, because we're left to wrestle with the character of the master and the character of the slave. Whose version of reality should we trust? Is the slave simply being cautious and prudent and burying his talent in the ground? Is he truly fearful of the failure that might come if he risks an investment with money that's not his own and it falls through? If his master is actually a ruthless and harsh businessman, as the slave says, then the fear of the slave is justified, and we can understand this desire for self-preservation. Is the rich man truly harsh? Is he someone who cannot be trusted to treat his servants justly? The Gospels contain other parables and other accounts of rich people who are unjust and oppressive. And so Jesus' Jewish audience wouldn't necessarily have given this wealthy landowner the benefit of the doubt. Is the slave wrong in his assessment of his master? The landowner has entrusted his slaves with vast sums of money, and for the ones who are faithful in their investing, he rewards them with more, and he invites them to enter into his joy. On the other hand, the punishment that the master inflicts on the slave doesn't seem to fit or be proportional to the failure. The slave hasn't lost any money. It's all there, intact, but he loses everything. He is thrown out into the darkness. His master's judgment is harsh, and it's a confirmation of the slave's words about him. Because this parable is not an allegory, there is not a hidden meaning to be drawn out of the story or clear and direct parallels between characters and real-life people or circumstances. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But because this parable was told in the context of the end, right? Christ is about to die, and it's told to a community that must follow Christ as they wait for his second coming. It's clear that we should draw some connections between the journey and return of the master and the journey and return of Christ. I'll also mention that because this parable has sometimes been interpreted in problematic ways, it's important to point out that this parable is not intended to be a lesson on financial investments. If that were the case, it would not be given by an itinerant rabbi with few possessions to his name, because he's not doing a very good job of practicing what he's preaching, is he? This parable is also not a commentary on talents as we understand them in the modern sense of the word, our abilities or skills. Same word, wrong meaning. So what then is the purpose of this parable? I think it's given to help us reflect on what it means to be faithful as we wait for Christ to return. The good news is that Christ has entrusted us with a treasure of great value. We have been asked to steward the gifts of his kingdom until he returns. What precisely does this commission look like? It's summed up at the end of Matthew's gospel in the words that Jesus says to his disciples at the very end, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." And what is the nature of this kingdom? We hear it described beautifully in Christ's synagogue proclamation in Luke chapter 4. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." We are called to be co-laborers with Christ as his kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. We are called to follow him, to invite others to follow him as the good news of the risen Christ reverberates throughout all of creation. So that's the good news of this parable, but what about the challenge? As this parable makes clear, those who are not faithful with the gifts they have been given to steward will be held accountable. And we see this theme of judgment in all three of this series of parables. The unfaithful slave who beats his fellow slaves and eats with drunkards is cut off and put in a place of judgment. The bridesmaids who forget oil for their lamps are shut out of the wedding banquet. And the slave who buries his talent is cast off into outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. I don't think any of these images of judgment are meant to convey literal details of what this judgment entails, but they do point to the truth that unfaithfulness does have real consequences. The parable of the talents reminds us that we are in danger of taking the gift of God's abundance for granted. Perhaps the slave's decision to bury the talents in the ground doesn't stem so much from fear as it does from indifference. If fear was his only motivator, and he knew that his master would be expecting some kind of profit, he would have also known that depositing the money in the bank was as safe as burying it in the ground, and he would have been guaranteed to at least earn some interest. As a money manager, he should have known better. Maybe he buried the money because he just didn't care. In his commentary on Matthew, Craig Keener points out that this phrase that we hear the slave say, "You have what is yours," was an expression used in Jewish transactions, and it meant, I am not responsible for this any further. So maybe when the slave says this to his master, "You have what is yours," we shouldn't hear a tone of assurance, as if he's saying, "It's okay, your money is still here." Maybe we should hear it in a tone of indifference. "Here's your money, it's not my problem anymore." Can you imagine being entrusted with a literal fortune worth years of wages only to treat it as if it had absolutely no value or consequence to you? What kind of slave or servant would do this? And I think the absurdity of this scenario is precisely the point. Isn't it also a little absurd, or at least surprising, that 12 disciples who spent every waking moment with their rabbi for 3 years, who witnessed his miracles and sat under his teaching and heard him proclaim his divine identity, struggled to be faithful to him at the hour of his death? If they struggled with faithfulness, the ones who should have stayed by his side, how much more do we struggle with faithfulness? We are prone to take the presence of Christ for granted, to take our calling for granted, to forget that we have been entrusted with something of great value, the good news of the gospel. In this season of Thanksgiving, as we prepare to celebrate a holiday that points us toward gratitude, and this morning, as we prepare to pray together a liturgy of thanksgiving for the birth of a child, it seems fitting that regular reminders to give thanks are a powerful antidote against indifference. In giving thanks, we are reminded that God is the one from whom all blessings flow. God is the giver of all good gifts. Gratitude helps us to remain faithful. The parable of the talents also reminds us that faithfulness requires risk. There is a reason that Jesus calls his followers to take up their cross and follow him. Discipleship has very little to do with our safety or our security. That's not to say that Christ doesn't care about our needs. He absolutely does. He is our good shepherd. But it is to say that faithfulness and comfort are sometimes at odds with each other. The servant acts out of self-preservation, and all too often so do we. But the problem with this is that it causes us to close ourselves off, to get so wrapped up in our own well-being that we forget that there is an entire world around us groaning for redemption. In his book, The Way Opened Up by Jesus, Jose Pagola places us in the shoes of the third servant, imagining what we might say to communicate our attempt to preserve God's gift. This is what he writes. Here is your gospel, your project for the reign of God, your message of love for those who suffer. We have kept it faithfully. We haven't used it to transform our life or to introduce your kingdom in the world. We didn't want to take chances. But here it is, undamaged. As people who live in a nation of wealth and power, most of us enjoying relative economic stability, people who don't live in fear of war or famine or oppression, what are the ways that we prioritize our own comfort over faithfulness? How have we made self-preservation into an idol? How have we boxed up and bubble wrapped and buried the good news of God's kingdom rather than seeing it for what it is, a gift of abundance that is meant to be shared with the world around us? If we're listening carefully, this parable should make us uncomfortable. It should challenge us and unsettle us. It should help us see the ways in which we are prone to take for granted the gifts of God and avoid the risks of faithfulness. But this parable also serves as a beautiful invitation. Christ calls us to enter into his joy, to share in his feast. One day when Christ comes in final victory, we will feast at his heavenly banquet. And even now, we are invited to the Lord's table, where we receive the abundant gifts of his presence and his grace, where we share in his joy, where we give thanks for his faithfulness to us. The table is set, the feast is prepared. All we have to do is receive. Thanks be to God.